I think it really gives the strongest case to do an RCT when you see these kinds of metabolic and mental improvements in patients. And not everyone experiences that. It's like an epilepsy. There's a proportion of patients who respond to ketosis. We won't understand what their proportion is until we do large trials. But I think for me, even if it would help, 1%, I think personally it will be quite a great amount of patients. But if it helps any amount of patients, I feel it's completely worth it to explore a treatment that could help hundreds of thousands of people.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Biohackers Lab. I'm your host, Gary Cohen, and on today's episode, I have Dr. Iain Campbell. Dr. Campbell is the Bazuki Research Fellow in Metabolic Psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh. His primary research interests focus on the role of metabolic dysfunction in the brain and central nervous system and how these relate to symptoms of serious mental illness. Iain, thanks so much for coming on for an episode for today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so I got to see your tweet of your recent pilot study that you did, which was really interesting around using a ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder. But what I find it also interesting outside of your results was there's a lot of good research coming out at the moment, it seems, around ketogenic diets, mental disorders. There's another one around schizoaffective disorder recently that's also just come out. So there seems to be a nice surge going on around do ketones benefit mental health disorders at the moment? So that's why I'm excited to get you on today to talk about that topic.
Yes, it is a sort of resurgence of interest, and it's something that's been in history with epilepsy. Ketogenic diet has been a treatment for epilepsy for 100 years and has 13 RCTs, and it clearly has these profound neurological effects. It was really explored by Russell Wilder at the Mayo Clinic through fasting patients and recognizing that some of their seizures were remitting, and then seeing that this might extend to a ketogenic diet in epilepsy, and this has been established. And the reason I'm interested in it for bipolar disorder is because we use anticonvulsant, anti-seizure medications to treat bipolar disorder. And so when you see, for the past 8 years or so, I've been highlighting in the patient community, myself included, that people are experiencing benefits of ketosis for symptoms of bipolar. I published in the BJ Psych Open about 160 patients maybe 5 years ago reporting this. And then since then, we've done a pilot trial to examine it in more depth.
Yeah, great. And so could you also just give just a little bit more around how metabolic psychiatry works in this case? Because I was actually reading one of your research papers where you laid this out. I think it was a 2024 paper that you did. So I'm using a little bit of your wording in there as highlights for the audience. But it seems like it's all about we've talked a lot about diets on this show, and it's the metabolism here that we're talking about, and how even things like insulin resistance and glucose control all tie into brain health, and if there's a dysregulation in the energy there and the mitochondria, then that can cascade to eventually maybe tip to an event like a mental health condition.
Yeah, so I kind of learned this the hard way, unfortunately. I live with bipolar disorder type 2 myself, and throughout many years of my life, I had very severe symptoms of this. Couldn't work, had to have extended periods out of work, unable to function, unable to live the kind of life that I wanted. And it really kind of came to a crux for me when there was a period of time where I was really severely unwell and there was no prospect of me having a kind of job or a family or anything that would make life worth living with bipolar. And this the case with many people that live with bipolar disorder. They're kind of living in this alternate life where they can't really function or contribute to the world in the way they want to. And so I tried every solution. Biohacking podcasts such as yours were my port of call for many, many years. And I tried everything, like every possible, if you went to a list of, I listened to sort of Dom D'Agostino and Bulletproof Radio, and the whole biohacking scene was what I was exploring to look for answers, because I wasn't responding to medications in the way that I wanted to. So I tried eventually I decided I would want to lose weight. This is at least something that I can control. It's within my kind of realm of possibility that I could lose some weight. And it was really motivated by wanting to have a family at the time. I was married, and I was trying to, I really couldn't, and I think my family knew that I couldn't really start a family at the time because I was so unwell. And so I really was motivated to try and do everything possible. I made this Google Doc where I listed every possible treatment I could try, every possible health optimization, metabolic improvement. And the first port of call was weight loss. And I tried this Atkins diet. And I tried a strict form of it called the sort of new Atkins diet, which puts you into periods of ketosis. And I didn't understand this at the time, but I was going into periods of ketosis and having alleviation of the severe bipolar depression I was experiencing for the first time. And I knew eventually I started to measure ketone levels, tried to understand this. And I saw that there was a correlation over a year measuring my ketone level with my mood symptoms between improvement. And I thought, this is something I'm going to study for the rest of my life. And I was studying a PhD in global health at the time. And I wanted to, and so I went into psychiatry to try and understand, is this something that could benefit other patients? And this led to our pilot trial. So yeah, the connections between metabolic and mental health is something I experienced firsthand. And it's something that many patients are starting to report and experience through sharing their experience online in case studies, pilot studies.
Well, thank you for sharing your personal story too, because you, as you said, you've got the lived experience now. So it's always nice, I think, like in your case, where you're saying you felt something personally, and you're being able to extrapolate it to a larger study, and you're seeing the same thing potentially happen to others at the same time. So you're onto something, hopefully.
Yeah, I think the connections between mental health and impaired metabolism are really well attested to in the literature. There's impaired glucose metabolism in brain imaging. There's 2 to 3 times the rate of insulin resistance type 2 diabetes in people with psychiatric conditions. And there's a long history of people trying metabolic treatment approaches in psychiatry that were never fully realized. But there was a thing called insulin shock therapy, for example, where it was a mainstream treatment where they would inject patients with insulin. And they would see some alleviation for a period of their symptoms, but it was a very severe treatment to undergo. And even in Russia, you can find literature of these asylums, and apparently this happened across Europe, that fasting was a mainstream treatment. There was a professor of psychiatry in Russia who was fasting about 6,000 of his patients. This was documented by Dr. Alan Kotz from America, who went and visited these asylums. And he was reporting significant rates of maybe about 70% of his patients having extended remission with fasting protocols. But of course, this is never referenced in the kind of Western literature. But there are psychiatrists who visited these asylums and verified some of the aspects of this. And they were so convinced of this in Russia that many of the doctors lobbied for funding for it. They carried out extensive investigations into why this might work. You can find a documentary about it, and I can give the link to this. But it was about fasting in these Russian asylums and all the investigations they carried out to try and understand why this might be helping. And they got close to the idea that it was ketosis. But at the same time, the Mayo Clinic were doing these studies in epilepsy showing it does appear to be ketosis that is mediating some of the anti-seizure effects. And there's a kind of question now of whether this state of ketosis mediates some of the effects we see in bipolar disorder.
Okay, yeah. And so when we talk about ketosis, and if I could use some of your experience, so you said, how long ago did you first get to experience the benefits where you thought something was happening? That was a few years ago now, was it?
So about 9-10 years ago, I started this Atkins diet. And,
Yes.
and then it took me several months to understand what ketosis was and start measuring my ketones. And this was through listening to sort of Dom D'Agostino and Dave Asprey, people at the time talking about ketogenic diet. And I realized this might be what's helping my symptoms. And I made an Excel sheet and tracked my ketone levels over a year versus my mood symptoms. And I saw a correlation. And we did the exact same investigation in our pilot study to understand if this might happen in other patients as well.
So do you, I know it'll be unique maybe to bipolar. Have you had to stay in ketosis, have you found, all of those years in order to help manage the symptoms?
Yes. So there are cases in epilepsy where, particularly in children, who will do this for 2 years strictly and they'll never have a seizure again. Their symptoms will completely remit. And this was a great hope of mine, that I would be able to do this strictly for a year or 2 years. I never have symptoms return, but unfortunately, I do need to stay on the diet long term to remain the benefits. And this is something that happens in older people in epilepsy. Many people get benefits from ketosis, but they have to remain on the diet for indefinitely to maintain the benefit. And I think it might be related to metabolic damage. If you find someone who's in the early states of metabolic damage in the brain, ketosis might give an opportunity to kind of repair this. Whereas if it's later stages, it might be, you might need to maintain consistent ketosis to have the benefits.
Okay, yeah, that makes complete sense with that one too. And so, like, how far into ketosis do you think you need to go in order to start feeling the benefits?
So there's some literature in epilepsy that suggests higher ketone levels are more beneficial. And typically, sort of children's hospitals will recommend 2 to 4 millimolar of ketosis. And in children, this is actually quite a bit higher, sort of 4 to 5 millimolar. I'm calling from a hospital where there's a neurological ward where children are treated with ketogenic diet. It's primarily used in pediatric epilepsy at the moment, but older people do also benefit from it. So the literature is particularly from young people, and it's showing kind of higher levels of ketosis, even in the +4 millimolar range. But this is, young people produce ketones much more readily, and in adults, it seems to be sort of 2 to 3 millimolar is more a reasonable target range for kind of older people. So we did look at this in the study, and we saw a correlation between ketone level and improvements in mood and energy and reductions in anxiety and impulsivity. We measured it daily alongside ketone levels alongside mood assessments. And it did look like above 2 millimolar, there might be some stronger effect. But this was a very small pilot study, 20 patients. And so we can't kind of draw any conclusions from it. But we do want to do a larger RCT and try to examine this in more detail.
And again, with your personal experience, do you try to maintain a certain level? Do you try to stay around the 2 level yourself?
Yeah, I found the most benefits above 2 millimolar, and particularly get that through fasting. And I particularly find sort of sources of animal fats helpful in achieving that. And sometimes I use MCT but above 2 millimolar, for me, there's a definite increased effect.
Okay, because talking about the MCT oil, that was going to be my one question is, so we're talking from a dietary metabolic point of view, which is endogenous, you making the ketones within yourself. But like using something exogenous to try to stimulate it, an MCT oil, or even some of these ketone drinks you get nowadays, do you think there's anything there that someone could sort of get a temporary experience of what a high ketone state does for your brain?
So I did experience this early on, and one of the things that really convinced me about ketosis was taking MCT oil, because I would take a CA MCT oil, and within 45 minutes, I would feel this kind of alleviation of this severe kind of depression. And the way I describe bipolar depression is it's not like feeling sad, or it's not like feeling down in the traditional sense. It's really like a profound deprivation of energy, and it almost feels like a deprivation of oxygen. You're really struggling to be alive during these states. It's quite a profound physiological state that's not well recognized, that it's not fully explained just by mood. But taking MCTOL, I felt this alleviate within sort of 45 minutes, an hour somewhat. And my wife would actually comment on this and say, like, you really seem different. Your facial expression, everything changes. With whatever you're doing, you should really kind of look into this and try to understand it. And so I think the best solution is the evolutionary consistent solution of periods of natural ketosis through fasting and a ketogenic diet. And I think this is something that was in our evolutionary history for most of human development, was periods of ketosis seasonally in response to food scarcity and in response to eating higher levels of animal fat in the diet. And I think this was something that was present throughout most of human history up until the agricultural revolution, where we introduced wheat into the diet and then we added sugar on top of that. And we've gone so far away from our evolutionary consistent diet that it's hard. It seems like you're making this radical adaptation, but really by reducing carbohydrate and going into ketosis, it's much more close to how humans evolved, I feel, to go through periods of ketosis. So I do think there's a real use for supplements, but also there's a lot of other things that ketosis does when you fast and you go into ketogenic diet, through signaling, through AMPK, mTOR, these metabolic mechanisms that are modulated through fasting and ketogenic diet, that are somewhat present probably with the supplementation. But I do think the kind of evolutionary consistent approach is the strongest one.
Yeah. And would the ketones help you both in both states, because you can be in a hyper-excited state, the mania state, or as you were describing, a low state? Does it at the end of the day, is the ketones trying to just get your energy metabolism back to a homeostasis, a good level again, that you don't have the big swings, do you think?
Yeah, so patients do report reductions of mania and hypomania, and also improvements in depression. So that really points to something interesting happening. In seizure and epilepsy, ketosis is reducing the excitability of the brain. by reducing the seizure threshold. And I think this is really interesting because we use anti-seizure medications to treat bipolar disorder, reducing the excitability of the brain. And one of the things I'd like to highlight is that these states are glutamatergic states. They're states of heightened glutamate activity in the brain. This has been well understood in epilepsy through seizures can be induced through glutamatergic mechanisms. And there's many animal studies and human brain imaging studies showing that glutamate is dysregulated. It's this kind of excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain that's kind of hyperactive in these states. And this also exists in bipolar mania, this glutamate hyperactivity. And so there's something about ketosis that we've seen across different ways of looking at it that reduces glutamate activity in the brain. And we've seen this from cultured astrocytes through to animal studies, through to human brain imaging. And we saw it in our pilot study where there was a substantial reduction of glutamate in the brain. And this was sort of 12, 13% into the brain regions we studied. And this is quite a significant reduction of glutamate. If you look at the literature on anticonvulsant medications, reductions of maybe 6%, 7% are quite common over a 3-month period. But we were seeing kind of 12, 13% reductions in an 6 to 8 week period just through inducing a ketogenic diet. So we're modulating something fundamental in the brain in ketosis that we're trying to understand. And this might be related to the mechanism of action in bipolar for both mania and depression. It's the kind of way of approaching glutamate in epilepsy and through pharmacology is through modulating the kind of receptors of glutamate and glutamate kind of mechanisms in the brain. But maybe glutamate is dysregulated because downstream of that, there's a metabolic imbalance. And when you fix, if you were to take an analogy, you could say that if you conceptualized, you're in a car and the car is filling up with smoke, one way to address that would be to try and block the smoke coming in through adjusting the air conditioning. And a better way to fix it would be to fix the engine that's on fire in the first place. And I think a lot of our treatments in psychiatry and neurological conditions are kind of like adjusting the air conditioning in the car that's on fire. And when you really address the engine, the metabolic issue at the root of this, it solves all of those downstream problems as well. So I think something about what we saw with the reduction of glutamate speaks to the roots of bipolar and epilepsy and some of these neurological conditions.
And with glutamate, because that does interest me, where as you're saying, what I was reading from your paper is it should just be a temporary state. So evolutionary, we would just have this hyperexcitability and then come back down. But in some cases, if it's gone awry, then we just get stuck in that state. Is that what happens for long? And how long can that excitatory state get stuck? Can you get stuck in there for? Is it just hours, days, weeks, months?
So in bipolar, this is called sort of hypomania or mania, and it can last for weeks, sometimes months. It's usually shorter than the depression period. Typically, depression is maybe 80% of the time. Mania is 20% of the time. But one of the most fascinating things about the occurrence of mania is the seasonal occurrence of mania. If you look at systematic reviews of when mania occurs, it tends to occur in the spring and around the autumn, but particularly in the spring. And this is related to changes in the photoperiod. So there's a rapidly changing photoperiod around the spring equinox. And when I interview patients, many of them describe the spring equinox as being a time of real risk for their bipolar symptoms to occur, particularly mania. And this is quite interesting because there's metabolic adaptations that happen throughout nature, throughout the animal kingdom, throughout our evolutionary history. I have a recent paper on this called Metabolic Plasticity that describes some of these dynamics. And essentially, many life forms throughout evolutionary history around the spring equinox will have hypermetabolic states. The most clear example of this is in the migration of birds, for example. They'll become hypermetabolic. Even if they're in captivity, you can see videos of animals in captivity removed from their natural environment, and they'll become hypermetabolic. They'll have insomnia. They're awake at night. They're trying to, because they're having this metabolic response to the changing photoperiod. This also exists in other species with mating and hunting and so forth. And in human biology, some of these core mechanisms are still preserved. Things like AMPK, mTOR, GSK3, some of these metabolic mechanisms that mediated seasonal adaptation are still present in humans. They're not as explicit as in states like these kind of states you see in evolutionary history, but they are active. And many of these mechanisms are also implicated in bipolar disorder. So I'm quite interested in the links between these kind of circadian mechanisms and metabolic mechanisms mediating seasonal adaptations. And I think the other side of that is also in the winter. If you look at systematic review, depression occurs particularly in the winter in bipolar disorder. And it appears to peak around the time of the winter solstice when photoperiod is at its lowest. And this is around the same time in nature that animals go into hibernation, for example, or states of torpor. And they're basically suppressing their glucose metabolism. They're suppressing their circadian rhythm to conserve energy. And so this was a kind of optimization of energy that occurs in nature, where it's optimizing energy use in the spring when it's most valuable, when there's opportunities for hunting, reproduction, migration, so forth, and suppressing glucose metabolism in the winter when there's less opportunity and it makes more sense to conserve energy. So this isn't a direct link to bipolar, but there is the underlying mechanisms that mediate these kinds of behaviors are implicated. These include things like clock genes, circadian mechanisms, clock and BMAL1, and metabolic mechanisms like AMPK, mTOR, GSK3, and so forth that are of central interest to bipolar research. So I think there's something about mania occurring seasonally, like you say, that could have been adaptive in a different world that we evolved in that is no longer helpful. And bipolar genes are preserved in the human population at 1 or 2%. And sort of evolutionary biologists have tried to understand why this might be the case. There seems to be some preservation of these genes that's beyond what you'd expect through just random, like if it was just a dysfunction that was being selected out of nature. There's a preservation of these genes. And so there might have been some adaptive function to hypermetabolic states in the spring and depressed metabolic states in the winter that is no longer relevant in a world of artificial light environment, food environment.
Yeah, I love it too, because I actually just recently had another guest on the show, Dr. Jeffrey, and it's all about infrared and how our light also is just knocking our mitochondria out. And so when I'm listening to you, I'm also trying to think about I know it's mitochondrial dysfunction and how the natural fluctuation of light, how that also induces different mental states is what I'm hearing. So again, I'm just going to tap into your personal experience because you've lived it. How do you find going into the spring state now? Do you manage to not tip into any mania stage because you stay within you use ketosis?
Yeah, I find the variation usually suppressed compared to not being in ketosis. If I'm not in ketosis, I find that winter can be particularly difficult and the depressive states are debilitating. I've never have bipolar type 2, which is where you have hypomania, but not full-blown mania. And so I've never had the kind of problem with the extremely elevated states. Hypomania for me was always actually quite helpful and productive, and it's not something you'd wish to have, but you can make the best of it to use it for productivity, creativity, and many patients experience this. Kay Redfield Jemison, a professor at Stanford, has a book about this that's very interesting that describes how there's some adaptive properties to having increased energy in the spring. And then that many people with hypomania experience creativity and productivity during these times. But I find it's greatly attenuated by doing a ketogenic diet. Being in ketosis, it levels out the swings in a way that makes life manageable. So, for example, those periods of time where I really couldn't work, and those, it's hard to imagine, but I would be unable to essentially leave the house for a month at a time with the severe states of depression. And it's really a state that feels like physiological exhaustion, where you can't move, you can't think, you can't function. And it's reflected in studies of this. They see elevated lactate in the blood as if you'd been running a marathon, but you're just lying, in your room. So it's a state of physical exhaustion, and ketosis alleviates that to the most degree of anything that I've tried so far. And I think this is really interesting because it speaks to this kind of perhaps energy metabolism component of bipolar disorder. And so, yeah, ketosis has definitely leveled out the swings for me more than anything I've tried to date.
Yeah, I'm just thinking maybe there's a little bit of a natural seasonality there where you'll be in deeper ketosis during the darker periods, and then you might find you naturally don't go quite deep, but your symptoms don't, become a problem for you.
Yeah, I think that there's a really interesting kind of conversation about insulin. You were saying about insulin resistance and how this relates. And if you look at what happens in the winter in life that is depressing its metabolism to conserve energy, is essentially it's downregulating insulin signaling. It's kind of reducing glucose metabolism by downregulating the signaling of insulin in the body. And these mechanisms are really throughout the bipolar literature. If you look at the two main targets of lithium, they're the phosphatidylinositol cycle and GSK3, and these are both central components of insulin signaling in the brain. I have a paper in Nature Translational Psychiatry about this, proposing that lithium might work through metabolic insulin signaling. And I think that this is the kind of adaptation that was adaptive in nature but becomes pathological in the modern environment. If you take someone who has a sensitive metabolic mechanism that allows them to have hypermetabolism and depressed metabolism in response to seasons, but you throw them into an artificial light environment, an artificial food environment with refined carbohydrate, it really presses on these mechanisms to the point where I think it pushes them into dysfunction and metabolic dysregulation. So, if you're in an evolutionary consistent environment with periods of ketosis, these increased metabolism states in the spring, depressed in the winter might be adaptive. But when you press on them so hard with refined carbohydrate consistently throughout the year, sugar and artificial light environment, you're really breaking those sensitive mechanisms and creating states of metabolic dysregulation. And this might be why you see this swing between depression and mania that's really extreme in bipolar, but exists in a lot of people, with seasonal affective disorder. Even in people and just healthy people, they experience kind of increased energy in the spring and less in the winter. So yeah, I think that there's a link between this kind of, like you're saying about with Ben Bigman, the interview about insulin resistance, that there's some link to how this might function also in the brain and cause states of dysregulated metabolism.
Yeah. I know, because we're talking primarily around your study with bipolar, but I'm going to be greedy and try to think, before you get to a clinical state like that, I think it sounds to me, it makes logical sense. Even someone who doesn't have a defined condition, just their mood, their energy levels in their brain, they're on this sort of the same pathway, because it's all the same metabolism in one sense, is what I'm thinking.
Yes, these metabolic mechanisms are conserved since the earliest forms of life, since the most basic forms of life, and many people think that metabolic mechanisms even precede kind of the genetic machinery in biology, that they're really fundamental to life, the ability to adapt your metabolism in response to the environment. And so these insulin signaling pathway, for example, is preserved from some of the earliest kind of C. elegans type life forms in a different form, but right up to mammals and then through humans. So this is like a fundamental machinery in nature to adapt metabolism to the environment that was necessary for survival. And it was subject to kind of significant selective pressure to be maintained across such diverse taxa across times. So I think when you see these mechanisms also appearing as targets of lithium and in the bipolar literature, it makes sense to examine them as maybe these are some of the things that are being dysregulated by our modern environment through insulin resistant states, dysregulation of metabolism.
Well, and as you mentioned earlier, you've got the fasting you talked about that will affect your insulin levels, the insulin therapy that they were giving people, just another one. It's all coming together. And how are you finding the acceptance of metabolic therapy within psychiatry? Are you seeing an acceptance and an uptick in using it as a modality?
So for many years, I was sort of turned down from every possible grant or fellowship application or funding. I had to actually work a full-time job and then do this research in the evenings. So I worked till, I wouldn't advise it for anyone with bipolar certainly, but I would work till sort of 2 a.m. to try and research this because there was no interest in it, and it was seen as like very left of, very kind of out of the realm of what psychiatry is interested in. But the kind of turning point was I basically was doing this researching whilst working a full-time job, and it became very discouraged by the constant rejection from grant applications, fellowships, so forth. And I decided I'll try to summarize what I've learned about this. So the first thing, in case this might be taken up by someone in the future, I was wanting to start a family, and I wanted to kind of I couldn't sustain this constant work load. So I kind of just thought I'll make a time capsule of this in case someone can pick it up in the future. And I published a paper in BJ Psych Open summarizing about 160 patient experiences of people with bipolar, about 140 of them reporting benefits of ketosis on their symptoms. And I published that in BJ Psych Open. And I also made a video summarizing everything I'd learned about this, about insulin signaling, about lithium, about bipolar, ketosis, and I put it in this 45-minute video. You can find it on a channel called Keto Bipolar. I no longer actually use that channel, but it was a kind of like time capsule I made. It just has that one video. And I also made a Twitter account. I'd never had a Twitter account before. And on Twitter, my very first tweet is this video, because I thought I'll put it out on here and maybe someone on Twitter will see it and it'll achieve something. And Chris Palmer, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard, found this tweet with this video, and he retweeted it and shared it. And Shibani Sethi at Stanford, who was a professor researching this, I didn't know these people at the time, shared it, and it was picked up by Jan Bazuki, who is someone whose son, Matt Bazuki, has bipolar as well. And they'd been on a similar journey. He tried a ketogenic diet. He tried about 30 different treatments across, the US healthcare system. And Jan is a philanthropic supporter of science research, and they had really unlimited access to try everything in the US healthcare system, and nothing was working for them. But they eventually got put in touch with Chris Palmer, and Matt tried a ketogenic diet, and after severe hospitalizations, many years of being in a lot of psychiatric wards, he went into remission and has remained so for the past few years on a ketogenic diet. And so Jan said, we need to research this and try and understand it. I'd been working with my father at the time, who was a doctor and a professor of medicine, and he saw the improvement I was experiencing and wanted to try to understand this scientifically. And so we worked together on publishing patient experiences, trying to get attention to this. And eventually we had a meeting with Jan. She reached out and said, would you like to meet and discuss some research? And we proposed a pilot trial. And I couldn't believe this at the time, because for so many years we've been really struggling to get any interest in this or any support. And this was kind of a last-ditch effort, putting out this video and Twitter account and so forth. And she said, we'll fund your pilot trial. She's funded a lot of scientific research projects across the US. And so this was how the pilot trial started, and we met a psychiatrist from Glasgow University at the time called Professor Daniel Smith. And he was really interested in circadian rhythm and bipolar disorder. And he said, this looks really interesting. We should try to examine this. And this is how we did our pilot study. Yeah, it's been a long road, and there was very little interest. But now things are really picking up. Because of our pilot study, we applied to the UK MRC, which is the largest medical funder in the UK. They're really the most kind of prestigious funder of medical research, funded sort of 32 of the most world-changing scientific projects coming out of the UK, which you can find on their Wikipedia. And we proposed a metabolic psychiatry hub to them based on emerging evidence of all this metabolic dysregulation and the potential for ketosis. And they funded us for 5 years to do a research program on this. So at Edinburgh University, it's funny to even say this now, but we have a 5-year research project all across the UK with about 30 staff looking at metabolic dysfunction and serious mental illness. And we hope to do large clinical trials of ketosis. But to answer your question directly about how psychiatry is taking on board, I think the best pulse check I got on this was we presented our pilot study findings at the Royal College of Psychiatrists International Congress in the last year at their International Congress, and it was really well received in a way that I didn't expect. I thought this was like having struggled for so long to have support for this, we thought this could really not be received well, but actually there was great interest in it. People were very enthusiastic. We were in a room. There's probably about 800 psychiatrists in the room, and they were all very interested in anything that might be useful or helpful for their patients. So it really gave me hope, because I felt like these are people who really care about their patients. They want solutions for them. And so we're seeing a kind of a real surge of interest in this now.
That's really great to hear, and congratulations on persevering through that and all that hard work for the fruits of your labor to finally come true. So that's so nice to hear. And I just think of risk-benefit kind of ratios here, and the risk of just changing someone's diet to be a little bit more healthy seems low, but the benefits, the upside seems high. And so maybe that's, and I know there's going to be cases where just diet alone could help with the management, but it could be diet plus still, regular care, but maybe medication levels could be lower or not as frequent or whatever. I don't know. And this is, I guess, where you got 5-year grant now, to go do all this testing, because it always props up questions and people want to know. But it's like, well, does it also mean like talk therapy within psychiatry suddenly has a breakthrough because someone's in a better state to accept something or reveal something, maybe?
Yes. I think we really want to understand who this could help and how it could help. Our pilot study was 20 patients, a small study, and all the patients remained on their existing medication, which is one of the great things about this therapy is you don't need to, change anything apart from just add it on to what the patients are already doing, and they can still recognize a benefit and make decisions from there. And I think that's the key thing is integrating this into psychiatry in a way that's kind of safe and helpful for people where, this is not at the stage where we can recommend this as a treatment just through a pilot study, but we want to examine this in a large RCT. And that's our next goal, is to do a kind of large RCT to really see, does this help on a broader range of patients and what are the dynamics there. But it was added on to their medication in all patients. And the remarkable thing about that is they lost weight, they reduced their blood pressure, they saw improvements in BMI. And this was on medications that typically cause you to get worse in all those parameters. The medications of bipolar have severe metabolic side effects. And we saw that they were losing weight, improving their blood pressure and BMI, even whilst taking those medications. So although it's not at the stage where we can kind of recommend it as a treatment yet, I think that it really gives the strongest case to do an RCT when you see these kinds of metabolic and mental improvements in patients. And not everyone experiences this. That it's like in epilepsy. There's a proportion of patients who respond to ketosis, and we won't understand what that proportion is until we do large trials. But I think for me, even if it would help, 1%, I think personally it will be much, quite a great amount of patients. But if it helps any amount of patients, I feel it's completely worth it to explore a treatment that could help hundreds of thousands of people. So in epilepsy, it seems to benefit up to kind of 80% of patients in some RCTs. In the Cochrane review, there's up to 80% of patients, depending on what trial you look at, responding well. In some it's a third, in some it's 60%, and some 80%. But this is such a substantial amount that it makes it worthwhile as a treatment to investigate. And I hope it'll be the same in psychiatry.
Well, there's someone probably going to be listening to this podcast. Like you tweeted out your video, someone will be listening to this in the same boat as you, building your spreadsheet, trying to figure out what to do. And maybe they can use this to then go speak to their, health professional and say, hey, I think, this is something that might be good for me, and it could be life-changing, same as it was for you.
Yeah, I think that's the best approach, is to have a dialogue with your psychiatrist about this. And the people I know who are successful with this are those who do it like on our trial with a psychiatrist and a dietitian supporting them, because it's complex doing ketosis with a psychiatric condition. The medications have significant metabolic effects. And the people who do well with it are those working closely with a psychiatrist and ideally a dietitian to do this. And in epilepsy, that's always been the case, is you have support from a neurologist and a dietitian, and this is what leads to success. So I think that there is a future. And the indication I have from psychiatrists is they're really struggling with getting effective long-term results for a lot of their patients. It's some do well, but many are treatment resistant and have long periods of severe kind of metabolic side effects of medications and are really struggling. And psychiatrists are very interested in anything that could be helpful to them. So you might find approaching your psychiatrist to discuss this, that they're open to it and they want to learn. And I think that's a great route forward if we continue this kind of collaboration between doing the science to establish this, and psychiatrists being open to it and take a sensible approach to it.
Yeah, I can actually think of one individual in my life who I know had bipolar, and he was on the medication, and the effects she was talking about, I remember him gaining weight when he went on to it. And it just gets me thinking too, is that where the drug resistance effect comes into play? Because could it be accentuate, unfortunately the treatment is there to give you the relief, but then is it also slowly also causing a bit of a metabolic issue with the weight gain and some of the other issues, and that's when it becomes drug resistance, and you have to, and that's where the frustration maybe comes in sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because one of the most clear effects, like you say, when you see someone go on these medications, particularly the kind of like olanzapine, things like this, is they'll gain perhaps 20, 30 pounds of weight within quite a short amount of time. You can really see the physical change in them. And this has always been viewed as a kind of just a pure side effect of the medication, that it's doing beneficial things, but this is a side effect of it. But maybe this is what some of these medications are doing, is they're so heavily suppressing metabolism, it stops you going into these hypermetabolic states like mania, but they're also not locking you in a state that's like this kind of torpor state that I was describing. There's really interesting research by someone called Brad Marshall on this, about the idea that these kind of depressed metabolic states in humans are analogous to kind of torpor phenotypes. And it's a really interesting area of discussion at the moment. And that's what it feels like when you're on some of these medications, that your metabolism and your function is so suppressed that you can't really live a full life, but you're not going to go manic and end up in hospital. And that's considered like you're responsive to medication, you're doing well. But really, I've experienced that, and you can't function in many cases, and you can't have any like real quality of life. But maybe fixing the upstream metabolic problem would actually allow you to have like a normal metabolic function, and not going between these extremes. So I think the idea, like you said, that this suppresses your metabolism over time so much, is a really interesting area to explore, and how medication works. And is there a better way where we don't just suppress metabolism, but try to restore it to normal functioning that prevents both the extreme of mania and the low state of depression?
Mm. And I'm guessing, as you said, most patients have insulin resistance, so that's something that's measurable.
Yes.
And you could be like, okay, everyone who's only on a medication arm, do they still stay insulin resistant? But this arm over here with the ketosis and the treatment, their insulin measurements, actually, the sensitivity, the resistance improves over time. So that's the one factor that you could use as a metric to see the change.
Yeah, we just had a presentation from someone called Ben Perry in the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub here in Edinburgh. And it was basically showing that elevated fasting insulin and insulin resistance are some of the most predictive markers of later onset of psychosis and mental health conditions. And if you look at like large databases that study this, there's a thing called the Amoris database, is a cardiovascular risk database. And they show that in the lead up to diagnosis with anxiety, stress, and depression related disorders, there's a 10-year metabolic decline that happens before the diagnosis. And it really accelerates in the 3 years before they're diagnosed, compared to the normal population. And I think that's really interesting, because what if you could intervene much earlier, at the 10-year point where someone has their first indications of metabolic decline, like in epilepsy, could you intervene with ketosis for 1 or 2 years and let the metabolic system repair and prevent this whole course of illness, like we see in epilepsy, extended remission? So I think that's the real promise of metabolic psychiatry, is it particularly for young people. When I went in when I was 15, 16 with my first episode, it was really, you're thrown into this world of confusion about how to deal with this illness and the metabolic consequences of medication. It can feel very hopeless for young people to experience this, unlike diabetes, where you go in and have a very clear treatment plan, and perhaps it's not optimal, but there's some route to having a kind of functioning life. So the hope for me is that maybe this is like epilepsy. You can intervene early, do a period of ketosis that allows this metabolic repair to happen when the brain is developing, and have extended remission, or avoid the course of illness. I've spoken to patients that have reported that with bipolar, very few at the moment, but I'm very interested in that potential. Could you intervene early and avoid some of this suffering for people?
Mm. So when's your next study coming out?
So we are working on a number of trials across genetics and population data, RCTs. I wish I could announce something. There's hopefully news coming very soon on an RCT. But the next thing I'll publish is a survey of 100 bipolar patients who are using a ketogenic diet and their experience. And to read these reports, I think will be quite notable for people to see the kinds of effects they describe on like improvement in quality of life, ability to function. And I'm also working on a couple of large circadian projects, Helios BD and Ambient BD, with Wellcome Trust. They're looking at circadian rhythm and bipolar. And so the real next thing we're excited about is an RCT, and hopefully we'll have something to share about that quite soon, because that's what really would help to change treatment and guidelines.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all of your knowledge today. I found it very enlightening. I love the connecting of the dots. So stuff that you says makes me think of other things, and just applications. Personally, what I'm already thinking about is if I was you can. I think even someone who doesn't have a disorder can feel hyper excited. They ate too many donuts or whatever,
Yeah.
and so they feel that tipping point. But could a little bit of a hack be just take a ketone drink or an MCT oil or something just to sort of pull you down and then sort that out? Don't go back into a binge state,
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and again, like the glutamate story is very interesting here because it's the most clear effect of ketosis we know about. Glutamate is related to seizure and hyperexcitable states in the brain. And we see consistent effects in the research so far that ketosis appears to reduce glutamate metabolism. And I think this is interesting because all the research in mental health is focused on a small subset of these monoamine neurotransmitters, serotonin, so forth, and the SSRI development of the 1980s. But glutamate is quite a different kind of neurotransmitter. If you look at the concentration of glutamate in the brain, it exists in much, much larger, like a order of magnitude larger concentrations than the other neurotransmitters. It's in millimolar concentrations, whereas all the other neurotransmitters are in submilimolar, micromilimolar concentrations. So it's really abundant in the brain. And there's studies showing that it's related to sort of up to 80% of the brain's energy metabolism is involved in these glutamate kind of processes. So a huge amount of the brain's energy is going towards regulating glutamate in the brain. And one of the most interesting things about that, as related to, like you're saying, states of hyperexcitability and ketosis, is that glutamate is also a metabolic energy source in the brain. It's a metabolic substrate in the brain. I have a paper in Nature Molecular Psychiatry called Metabolic Overdrive Hypothesis that proposes this. And basically, glutamate is participating in the same energy processes in mitochondria as ketones do. It has a similar role to what ketones fulfill in mitochondria. It acts as a fuel source and energy source. And this was the original focus of research into glutamate by Hans Krebs in the 1960s. The Krebs cycle is obviously named after Hans Krebs. And he studied glutamate as a metabolite in the brain that contributes to energy production. And then when the SSRI development came along in the 1980s, we just completely reconceptualized it as a neurotransmitter. That's the only function it has. Whereas actually it's a significant energy source in the brain that seems to be dysregulated across these neurological psychiatric conditions. So when you say reducing these hyperexcitable states in mania with ketosis, there's a real biological basis for this and a kind of mechanism that we can study. And I think that's going to be a really interesting journey in metabolic psychiatry to understand what is the metabolic role of glutamate in the brain, and are ketones regulating its function and reducing its function to make the brain more calm. So I think there's real biological basis to what you're describing that we can explore and verify and study over time of why this might reduce these hyperexcitable states.
And hopefully, can you solve hangriness in teenagers too?
My wife calls it hypoglycemic. Yeah, definitely. I think that came from Dave Asprey. But yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, it makes sense though, right? If your brain is so sensitive to any energy deficit, that it would make sense that it panics and wants to do anything to get out of this state. So yeah, I think if you have stable energy, maybe that could be maybe that's the primary outcome of this research is getting rid of the hangriness.
Yeah, I'm going to try N=1 on my my eldest and see if that solves some stuff during some play. Just take this little coconut capsule or whatever. It's just like, oh yeah, there we go, bingo, gotcha. Well, Iain, I just want to, I know we're a bit pressed for time on this one, but I just want to say thank you so much again for everything you shared, from your personal stories, your research findings, and I'm really excited to see what comes out from your research. And I love learning more about metabolic psychiatry. But if anyone wants to keep up to date with what you're up to, any resources you want to lead them to?
We interview patients, myself and Matt Bazicki, who I mentioned, on a podcast called Keto Bipolar. This is people with bipolar who are doing a ketogenic diet, sharing their experience. And I'm on Iain Campbell, PhD, share about our upcoming research on there.
Brilliant. Again, thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much. Good to be with you.